In this video presentation, we'll look at the visual approach and landing for the Cessna 150M and discuss the stabilized approach criteria. Visual approach can take many forms depending on traffic, ATC, weather, noise abatement procedures, and more. In our example, we will consider a typical entry onto the downwind leg of the traffic pattern as shown here. Pilots will need to be able to adapt this profile to their specific situation. The approach preparation begins once the airport information has been received and the pilot has determined the runway to be expected. The pilot should review the weather, arrival procedure, and how the traffic pattern is to be entered. Any hazards should also be carefully considered, such as nearby obstructions and NOTAMs. The descent approach checklist should be initiated early enough to ensure it is completed in full at least 15 miles from the destination. As you near the airport area, complete the before landing checklist items down to the line. The remaining two items, which include the carburetor heat and flaps, will be addressed once the aircraft begins the final descent to landing. The aircraft should join the traffic pattern in a clean configuration at 80 to 85 knots indicated airspeed. A power setting of 2300 RPM is a good initial starting point, with small adjustments made from there to obtain the target speed. The descent from traffic pattern altitude usually begins at a point on the downwind leg when the aircraft is abeam the landing runway threshold. However, traffic or ATC instructions may require the downwind to be extended. In such cases, the descent and approach will need to be delayed until a more suitable point. To begin the descent, reduce the power to 1700 RPM and turn the carburetor heat on. Next, verify the airspeed is at or below the maximum flap extension speed of 85 knots and extend the flaps to 10 degrees. Begin a descent at 70 knots. The flap indicator is located on the upper left doorpost, which places it in an awkward viewing position. Many pilots prefer to hold the spring-loaded flap handle down and simply count 2 to 3 seconds for each 10 degrees of extension desired. Begin the turn to the base leg when at the 45-degree point to the landing runway. The flap should then be extended to 20 degrees and the airspeed maintained at no slower than 65 knots. The base leg is an important point to assess height and make any major adjustments. It is also a good time to check the extended approach path for any traffic that may conflict. Always make a coordinated turn onto final, being sure to avoid excessive angles of bank. If the final approach course is overshot by a significant distance, consider a go-around as a better option. With the plane established on final and the landing runway assured in the event of an engine failure, extend the flaps to 30 degrees. This completes the before landing checklist line items. The use of 40-degree flaps is only permitted for short field operations or emergency landings. The significant drag created by 40 degrees of flaps on the Cessna 150 can reduce go-around performance and make a climb impossible should the pilot be unable to retract the flaps due to a flap motor failure or other malfunction. A final approach speed of 60 knots is appropriate when using a flap setting over 10 degrees. For approaches with 10 degrees or less of flaps, the final approach speed should be increased to 65 knots. In windy conditions, a reduced flap setting and increased approach speed will give the pilot more controllability at the expense of increased landing distance. If winds are gusting, the pilot should increase the applicable final approach speed by 1/2 the gust factor for better controllability and increased margin above stall speed. For instance, if the winds are reported at 9 knots, gusting to 15 knots, the pilot would add 3 knots to the approach speed. The last and most important topic of this presentation is the stabilized approach. The NTSB accident database is filled with reports involving pilots who try to save a faulty approach only to wind up damaging the airplane, or worse. A stabilized approach is one of the most important aspects of a successful landing, and something each pilot should incorporate into their standard procedures, no matter what type of aircraft they fly. A stabilized approach refers to one in which all of the following parameters are met without exception. Number 1, the aircraft is configured for landing, meaning the flaps and landing gear are set. Number 2, the aircraft is aligned on the proper glide path and on the runway center line with no drifting. The approach speed is within plus 10 knots and minus 5 knots of the target VREF. 4. There is no excessive sink rate required to land within the first one-third of the runway. And finally, no excessive pitch, bank, or power inputs are required to complete the approach to landing. For light general aviation airplanes like the Cessna 150, all stabilized approach criteria should be met by 200 feet above the landing runway, unless terrain or other factors require a higher altitude. If one or more conditions of the stabilized approach criteria are not met by that point, a go-around should be initiated as the safest course of action. This concludes the normal approach and landing discussion. Let's head out to the airplane and see it in real time. The video starts with the aircraft approaching the abeam point on the downwind leg at a non-towered airport. The descent approach checklist and before landing checklist down to the line have already been completed.
Abeam to landing runway. Power back to 1700. Carburetor heat is on.
Airspeed in the white arc.
Flaps 10 degrees. 1001, 1002, 1003. Begin our descent at 70 knots. Turning base legs 70 knots. 10 degrees of flaps. Flag of traffic, Cessna is turning left base runway 27, touch and go flag go. Flaps 20 on base, 1, 2. And we'd like to slow to 65 knots here. Flag of traffic, Cessna is turning final runway 27, touch and go flag go. Turning final 30 degrees of flaps. About 2 seconds again on that. And we're looking for about 60 knots.
.200 feet stabilized.
Get over the numbers. Boost the power to idle. And we'll just hold the nose off. Let the nose down.
When the aircraft is taxied clear of the runway, the pilot should perform the after landing items. The order is almost identical to the before takeoff line items and should be performed in a logical sequence as shown here. This concludes the visual approach and landing presentation for the Cessna 150M. This has been a presentation of TimeBuildUSA. TimeBuildUSA offers exceptionally clean late model Cessna 150 aircraft to pilots for extended rental periods. Now you can have access to your own aircraft for days or weeks at a time. Visit us online at TimeBuildUSA.com.